Okay, while we're waiting for a moment, I'll tell you an interesting tidbit. I was looking over the Halachat of Purim, and I refreshed my memory on this, and I found it very fascinating. You know, if you asked an outsider about a normal Purim, they would say, you know, what's Purim known by? The mania of coming to shul and all the noise. Making a noise on Haman is pretty kind of basic Purim trivia, right? If you had to make an association of the festival. And the truth is, you do not find this anywhere in the Gemara. You don't even find it in the Code of Jewish Law. But then the Ashkenazi gloss on the Code of Jewish Law, the Ramah, who lived in Krakow, we always go and visit his shul when we're there, for those of you who've been with us to Poland, he writes a little note at the bottom. And he says, a minhag has developed, a custom's developed, that children are going to shul with little pieces of wood or stones, and they're writing on the stones or the wood the name Haman, because the biblical command, like we read on Shabbat, is to wipe out the memory of Amalek. So what they did was, as they were reading the Megillah, it's probably quite a good fidget toy, to be honest, they would rub the stones or the wood together, and the words that they had written would get rubbed off. And there they had wiped out Amalek. But of course, by, default, what else happened? I asked one of my kids this. They said, oh, well, if you rub two stones together, they probably also made a fire. But I wasn't getting at that. But as, of course, they rubbed the stones together, they made a noise. So suddenly people started to associate the custom with making a noise for Haman instead of wiping out this, what they had written. So what's really interesting about this is that, there are many, many customs that have developed over the years. And we all joke about them, how, in 50 years, people are going to think that this is a custom, having iced vodka in the Kiddush or whatever, that developed just because it happened, right? And sometimes it's called a minhag shtut, like a minhag that came out of foolishness almost. It didn't have a basis. Sometimes, the Ramah will come along and he'll say, that's a silly minhag. You should tell people not to do it because they erroneously started doing it. And here he doesn't say that. He says, don't stop it because everything happens for a reason. I haven't got to the inner, I'm sure there's some inner hidden Kabbalistic secret in there. But obviously what he was saying was, know the wood for the trees, that making a noise on Haman wasn't the original big deal, but still it's happened and therefore it should be embraced. Anyway, that was just while we were waiting for anyone else who wanted to join us. But I found that quite interesting. I think my kids were a bit horrified that I might have been suggesting that we should stop all noise making. But they were happy to hear the end of the Ramah. Okay, let's make a start. Last week, we saw the command to build the Mishkan, build this portable tabernacle to be able to serve God. And we spoke last week about the how every single part of the Mishkan had a symbol that's relevant for our lives as human beings. Each one represented a different part of the Jewish people. We specifically spoke about the cherubs and their symbolism. But now this week, it's extended a stage further. If last week we spoke about the vessels in the temple, this week we start to talk about the clothes for the priests. Now, should this be something that so much time is dedicated to? It's essentially the same question we asked last week. Why do we need so much time about the architecture of a building that was there for a very short period of time? And we tried to look at the symbolism of what lay behind that. And now the question is, well, since when do we want to kind of be so fascinated by clothes? Why are the outer garments? That's surely not what's important. It's the inside that counts. So why is so much time and space dedicated to the clothes of the priests? Now, just to backtrack for a moment, before we get to the clothes, we have just two verses in which we have a beautiful symbol, which is that last week we were told about the construction of the menorah. And this week, the ParSHa begins by telling us how all the Jewish people should go out and should make olive oil. Why did everybody suddenly need to be involved in making this olive oil, and it had to be this pure olive oil? So it strikes me that there is a symbolism here. Last week we spoke about the symbol of the cherubs and the ark. The ark's the central feature of the temple, but its parallel is the menorah. What does the ark symbolize? The cherubs and God's communication with them. That is like the divine fire that's coming from heaven to earth. The lighting of the menorah is the opposite. It is lighting a fire that goes from earth to heaven. And that is essentially what the temple should be all about. It's not one way, it's about both. It's about the coming together, God for the people and the people to God. And the message that comes at the beginning of our ParSHa is, this is something that should be for everybody to partake in, and not just for, the Kohanim. Everybody should feel that this purpose of being able to connect, between earth and heaven with this fire-like symbol, this is something that's for everybody. And of course, what's so interesting is that when it came to the Second Temple period, there was no ark, because they never found what had happened to the ark. It had miraculously sunken, according to the Talmud, and where the Babylonians came, and it never rose again. And so they didn't have the ark and the tablets. What did they have? Just the menorah. And so this became, if you ask somebody today, if you could go and retrieve one thing from your shul and take it out, what would it be?
The Torah? You're going to say the menorah.
No, I would agree with you. I mean, obviously it's a subjective question. I don't think there's a right and a wrong, but that is kind of your vision, the end of Fiddler of the Roof, of them going and collecting the Sifrei Torah from the shul. I think that's probably most people's gut feeling. But I think that in the times of the Second Temple, the Sefer Torah symbol for us today was the menorah then. And you have, accounts of Hellenized Jews who were wound up to go into the temple and take something out, and promised, but that they would be able to keep it, which of course they weren't. And so what did they go and take? They went and take the menorah. And even look at Titus's arch. What's the icon there? It's that menorah being carried out. And I wonder if that powerful symbol, which of course has come with us over all the generations, to the point that we've taken it into our homes, that even in the darkest times, we still have that feeling of us wanting to connect up. That's what the menorah is all about. And in a certain sense, that's what the mantra of our people has always been. And that's not the job of priests or just the leaders, but actually that's what everybody starts this week by having to go and gather the oil for that purpose. But straight after that, we now go onto these clothes of the high priest. Now there's the high priest's clothes and there's the regular priest's clothes. And the regular priest the regular Kohen has four garments. The high priest has 8 garments. Now, whilst we can say, what does it matter whether it's 4 or 8? The detail that the Torah goes into is clearly holding some significance to this. So I'm just going to share the screen with you for a moment to see the very interesting way with which this is presented to us. So it begins by saying, Va'asita bigdei kodesh la'aron achicha lechavod u'letiferet. You should make these clothes for your brother Aaron. And then we're given 2 descriptions. They should be, what's kavod? For honor and for glory. When they light the torches, if you've ever seen the Yom Ha'atzmaut ceremony at Har Herzl in Israel, the national ceremony, and they have this very, very grand ceremony, and they choose every year people to light the torches. As they light it, they always say, Uletiferet Medinat Yisrael. It should be for the splendor of Medinat Yisrael. So the idea of these Kohanim having these clothes was for kavod and tiferet. But what does that mean? What was the purpose of these clothes? Is it saying that there needs to be some sort of wow factor, that when people when people come to visit and they see these Kohanim dressed in these regal garments, they go, wow. Is it for other people, or is it for other people to notice and have that wow, or is it for them themselves to notice and feel different? We're not sure. But when we look at the next line, the next two lines, we see two very interesting things. The first is what Moses is told to do. This is a phrase that we see repeated over and over in the building of the temple, that they were called wise of heart. Generally, you're wise because you're wise here. When it came to the building of the temple, and by the way, generally, King Solomon, he was also described as a chacham lev. It's not about IQ, it's about EQ. It's interesting that when you look at the Tanakh, you see what, all the kind of modern, the last, 10 years we've been talking about EQ, and that's really the emphasis here. Go and speak to those who are wise of heart, those that I filled with a spirit of wisdom. And they should make these clothes for Aaron. But you don't need somebody who's wise of heart to make clothes. You need somebody who's, got a good eye, who's got a good hand, who's a good designer. So why are they described as needing to have a wise heart? And my third question is the one coming up, and then we could try and put all of this together. Can you see over here, line 4? These are the clothes you should make. Now we're going to count them. Now this sounds like a technical detail, but I believe that the sort of almost hidden meaning of the clothes is hidden over here. Now, do you remember that I mentioned before that a regular kohen, there are 4 garments, and for a high priest, there are 8 garments. And I'm going to just share with you for a second. Can you now see a picture? Yes. Okay, that was good. That worked. Okay,
yes.
Here great. Can you see over here? This is the high priest. It's not a brilliant picture, but you can see here the 8 garments. I'm just going to show you very quick because I always find otherwise the ParSHa is so confusing. This is the mitznefet, the white turban on his head. Yeah. Now you can see that they're all wearing, all these priests over here, they're all wearing this white turban, but he has an extra piece. It's a bit like a tiara or a in Harry Potter, the thing they take from Ravenclaw. Anyway, that's a Harry Potter, only if you know it will you get it. But here it's like a golden tiara piece, and it had written on, this was called the tzitz, and it had written on it, Kadosh Lashem, holy for God. Then you can't see them, but you have white trousers under here. But note that you can't see them because the tunic was so long that therefore you didn't see the trousers underneath. They were basically an undergarment. Then you have this white, which you can see the high priest also has, a ketonet. So this is like a basic tunic. Then you have the belt. And then you have for the high priest, he also has this special me'il, the blue coat that you can see there. And then he also has the ephod, this kind of apron part, and the choshen. Okay, all together, that makes how many? 8. Okay, why do I say this? Let's go back into the pasuk, and you're going to see that there are 2 garments that are purposefully missing from our list. They're going to be mentioned later in the ParSHa, but the question is, if you're mentioning clothes, then why don't you just give us the list of the 8 here? Why would you purposefully leave out 2? It doesn't seem to be a very efficient way to do things. Okay, so can you see? Here we go. Here's our list. The choshen, that's the apron that we saw, the ephod, ume'il, and the cloak, uketonet, and the tunic, tashbet mitznefet, the turban, va'avnet, and the belt. What's missing? Yeah, the trousers. I'm getting really good at lip reading, by the way. The trousers, right? The trousers are missing, and there's something else missing. Yeah, see, I'm getting good at lip reading. The tzitz, that golden tiara thing, okay? And the question is, well, why would they be missing? And by the way, you saw that the next words, I'm not going to share again, it says, and make me clothes. Now, we normally read this. I've always read this as summary. Make these clothes for me. Here's the list. So make the clothes. But then again, that's just repetitive. So actually what it seems to be saying is, make clothes. Here are 6 of them, but there are some others, but we're not mentioning them here. So the next mention of make clothes is the other clothes. So why didn't you mention them here? Because here we're speaking about clothes with a particular purpose. What's the purpose of these clothes? Lekavod or letiferet, for glory and splendor. So now let's look at the missing clothes and see why they're not in the list. What about the trousers?
Not for glory.
Yeah, you don't even see them, right? So in fact, some of the commentaries, like the Chizkuni says, they're not even really, it's not even a clothes, it's an undergarment. It's not really a beged. It's not sort of a piece of clothing. It certainly doesn't bring you glory. It's almost like, it's a prerequisite, is it not? That you're going to have your under trousers on, right? So we're not going to put it in a line about all these dignified garments because it's just a basic. So would that make sense that that's why the trousers are not there? But then you say to yourself, well, then why did you even need to mention the trousers at all? If it's obvious that a priest's going to wear his under trousers, just like it would be obvious to us that we're going to wear underwear when we go out, you don't need to put that in the list of, the designer items that we're going to parade. Then why even mention it in the list of garments? Before we answer that, let's look at our other extreme, because it seems to me that it's the two extremes, it's the two opposites that are not mentioned. The one is the most lowly, almost irrelevant, the thing you wouldn't even think to mention, the under trousers, which as we saw in the picture, you couldn't see when they walked around. In fact, if anything, they say that was one of the reasons that they had a ramp in the temple instead of steps, because they didn't want it to be immodest. That when the priests were walking, you started to see, right? So there was kind of, and then they had the under trousers as well, but you didn't really see them at all. Then we have the opposite extreme. What's the other end of the spectrum? The tzitz. This is, you could say, is the most precious. In fact, when it's described later, it's described as it's the only one of the garments that is described itself as being kadosh, holy in itself. The others are garments. Right? If you wear them, maybe you'll bring a certain holiness to them, but this is described as being holy. Now, what's the role of the tzitz? So the tzitz was put on right at the end. When would the trousers have been put on? Right at the beginning. So here comes, we've got the trousers that are not mentioned, then all the other garments are put on, and right at the end. And this was very, especially at this point in time, would have been very, very meaningful, because as the Kohen would be anointed, the last thing that would go on his head, once that tzitz was put on, there was a status change, and then they would pour the oil over his head to anoint him as the Kohen Gadol. So there seems to be something really special about this tzitz, about this golden tzitz. But then is that not kavon and tiferet? Doesn't that bring splendor? Fine, miss out the trousers, but to miss out the most precious, the most glorious? So why is the tzitz missed out?
Why?
Are you agreeing with my question?
Is it something to do with humility?
Well, that's very, very interesting, Jeremy, because the Talmud, you have actually this in the Jerusalem Talmud and also in the Babylonian Talmud in slightly different versions, explain that all the garments, they each had a role. That they're not just about having a uniform that made, had this wow factor when people walked in, but each one actually atoned for something else for the Jewish people. The trousers atoned for any sexual transgressions that might have been committed. The tzitz atoned for arrogance. So that's very interesting that maybe, so you're saying that by missing it out, it's almost not giving it space to become too much of a big deal. Perhaps. Okay, I want to not really backtrack, I want to sidestep for a second to share a story in the Talmud, which is about the tzitz. It's a story that reminds me so much of the Purim story. And I hope from there we'll be able to bring these pieces together to understand perhaps a little bit about this pattern of these clothes, this set of clothing, the symbolism of the clothing, why the clothes are suddenly important, and also perhaps why in the Megillah of Purim, there is so much attention on clothes And of course, it's trickled down to today when Purim's all about dressing up and disguising and wearing something different. The story is told in the Talmud of, this was right at the end of the Second Temple period. There was a king called King Yanai. Some of you may have heard of him. And Josephus writes quite a lot about him. And he comes at the end of the Temple period. And at that time, it's the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. They were often doubling up. The Hasmoneans were kings and they were also high priests. And so King Yanai is Kohen Gadol and he's high priest. Now he goes out and he has a brilliant victory in war. He conquers 60 cities in the desert and he comes back. Now at that time, you've got a big rifts opening up within the Jewish people of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, those who accept the broader oral law and those who are more narrow. And he doesn't quite know how he's thought of. You can see he's a little bit insecure. And so he turns to all the chachamim, all the wise people, the rabbis of the time, and he says, look at my victory. But you know what? We shouldn't be arrogant. When at the time that our parents and our grandparents were building the temple, they had nothing. They ate salty foods because that's all they could afford. We should make a meal. And we shouldn't have a feast to celebrate my victory, but we should eat salty foods. So it's a bit ironic. He has this massive banquet. He brings out tables of gold. And all the wise people come. It's a massive, I imagine, kind of festival in the temple precinct, but they eat salty foods, don't worry, because of course they're not having a party. But whilst they're all together, they're also not all together. And there's one troublemaker there, because you've always got to have at least one, who comes up to him and he says, the rabbis who've come here, they don't really like you. They're not really on your side. They really suspect you. So he says, well, what should I do? So the troublemaker says, you know what you should do? You should put on the tzitz and have it on at the Su'udah. Now, do you remember that it has engraved on it the words, Kadosh L'Hashem, holy to God? When they see that, they'll have to stand up out of respect for you. And that will sort of be a way of knowing that they really respect you. It'll be a litmus test, okay? So you can see his insecurity, the fact that he just listens. You just got one troublemaker who can say an absurd idea. He goes for it straight away, puts on the tzitz, and something about him putting on the tzitz, it's almost like it hits a nerve. And one of the rabbis gets up and says, is it not enough for you that you're the king? You shouldn't really be the Kohen Gadol. It turns out that he had a little bit of a murky history, but they didn't have witnesses, and you always need 2 witnesses in Jewish law to prove something, and they didn't have witnesses to show that his history was a bit tricky, and therefore they couldn't say he wasn't fit to be a Kohen Gadol, but they didn't really believe him fit to be the Kohen Gadol. And so suddenly this beautiful party that's brought everybody together ends in disaster, with this one sage saying to him, how dare you, you should just be happy that you've got the crown of being a king. Why do you have to have this on? And of course, then the troublemaker comes back in and says, is this how you're going to let them treat you? And he kicks all of them out. And then they start to essentially sort of punish all the rabbis. And the words of the troublemaker are, let the Torah sit in the corner. We don't need rabbis to come and be so pushy and teaching things. Just let it be. And actually, essentially, they all ended up getting killed until a further point in history. It's a very sad story. But my question is actually almost a side question, which is, why was it that it was when he put on this tzitz that broke, this very fragile piece that he was trying to create? There's something about that image. I mean, even just when I felt like I read the story through, you read this story about this massive party and the Kohen Gadol comes out and they're all eating and he's wearing the tzitz. Does it sit well with you? No. Why not?
He's not entitled.
He's not entitled. In what sense?
He doesn't have the right to be a high priest, does he?
Okay, but they didn't have witnesses to say that he couldn't be the high priest. So that was almost like, the sage was so furious at seeing him in the tzitz that he almost let out, I feel like, feelings that were damaging to bring out when you don't have proof. Those feelings, that suspicions that one has, but that you need to let them go, unsubstantiated worries. The thing for me about the tzitz is I imagine the Kohen Gadol in all his clothes, standing in the temple, helping people, inspiring people, bringing them to their service. I don't want to imagine him standing at a massive feast, sitting there eating and having a good time, and his own pleasure parading around in these garments. It doesn't feel right. And you know what it reminds me of? Does it remind anyone of anything that's coming up? The Purim story. How does the Purim story begin? All the people are sitting around at this feast, including a lot of Jews. And what are they eating from? They're eating from vessels that came from the temple, that their enemies have essentially looted, but they're all having a good party because as long as they've been invited to the king, they're doing well. So something here about the tzitz that was the trigger point that caused this argument that then went horribly wrong with a domino effect. Now, we've got 2 minutes to put all of our pieces together. So what I believe this story really shows us about the tzitz is that the tzitz is almost the finishing touch. It's the cherry on the cake. It's the moment that the Kohen says, I'm different. I'm separate. It's actually referred to as a Nezer HaKodesh. And Nezer is like, there was the Nazarite, like Samson, person who had decided they were going to abstain from wine. They were going to live separately. They were going to, have a different life. Essentially, that's it. Is the reminder to the high priest that says, you've got a different life. You're not your own person. You're representing an entire nation. And therefore, you have to have that total focus, mindfulness, consciousness of the holy service that you're entering into. And that's why when he was in the temple, he had to have that tzitz on his head all the time. As much as it was a reminder to the people, it was a reminder to himself. And therefore, it strikes me that what we have in this set of garments is a process. It starts off with the basic, simple things. Kedusha, sanctity, isn't the special moments of our lives, the feeling connected, doesn't come just from golden tiaras. It comes from the basic things. It comes from the things that no one else sees and no one else hears, and sometimes for us feel almost too unglamorous, the undertrousers. That's where it begins. And from there, they're not for kavod and tiferet. It's not splendor and glory. It's basic rootedness, but it's meaningful. Then come the other garments. And when all those other garments are on, we go to the other extreme, which is the most special of all, the one that's not really a piece of clothing either. It's more of an accessory. That's why it's also not mentioned in the list, because if you have those, the process in the middle that's all important. And then you can get to the tzitz. And when you get to the tzitz, it's the transition moment. It's the moment that says, okay, now I recognize that there's a consciousness here. There's a connectedness. I'm not just here for myself, but I, as the Kohen, am actually here to service my people, to represent my people, to connect my people. That cannot coexist with sitting and having a wonderful banquet, because that's for myself, even if I try and fool myself that it's not. And therefore, that's what the tzitz represented. When we bring this back to ourselves and to Purim, we see that this is one of the main themes that's running through the Purim story. You can have the vessels of the temple, but if they're being used in the wrong way, then it's meaningless and it's a profanity. And it's one of the reasons that the Megillah is written as a satire, but we often don't always pick it up. And that's why you have these, all the royal clothes. But what do the royal clothes mean? If they're just there as royal clothes, do they mean anything? If they're there as a symbol of reminding you who you are and your purpose, then they're there for something significant. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons that on Purim, what we actually do is we remind ourselves that just putting on clothes is not enough. Sometimes we get stuck in those clothes. We get stuck in those roles. Purim's the time that we remind ourselves that it's the mixture of our own thoughts and our own connectedness. And then we turn it out, and the clothes help us do that. And so we mix all the clothes up into different clothes and to different costumes. We almost confuse ourselves so that we can start again by building up our own set, building up our own pattern. And within that pattern, it's made up of the most basic things that bring us our meaning and feeling connected. And then we build it up, that it also includes that feeling of real kedusha, of real sanctity, of the special moments, the high moments. And that's what's represented by the tzitz. So I suppose I wanted to look at this more technical aspect of how these clothes fit together, because I think that beneath the symbol of the clothing is actually really a paradigm for all of our lives and the way that we connect, each one as an individual and as human beings with God. And of course, that when you go back to the temple, this wasn't just about the priest's clothing, but just like we saw that the vessels of the temple actually each held a symbol for every single person in Israel, so too the clothes were to give a paradigm for every single person of how they could make their own set of clothing, their own ladder of connectivity, to feel that they're really living a life of small meaning and of grand purpose. So wishing everybody a safe and very happy Purim, and hope to see you next week. I think we're going to go till the end of Shemot. So we've got 3 more weeks in the series.